The morning was cold and damp, the kind that seeps into your bones and clings to your clothes. The square was already bustling with a crowd, their breath forming mist in the chilly air. The wooden gallows loomed in the center, its dark stain a grim reminder of its purpose. The executioner, a burly man with a stern face, adjusted the rope, his hands sure and practiced. The condemned, a young man with a wild look in his eyes, was dragged to the platform. He struggled, his voice hoarse with fear, but the guards held him tightly. The crowd murmured, a mix of anticipation and morbid curiosity. Some whispered about the crime, a theft that had turned into a murder. Others talked about the man's family, left to grieve in the shadow of this public spectacle. The city authorities, dressed in their finest, watched from a raised dais, their faces stern and unyielding. The bishop, a man of stern reputation, gave a brief sermon, his voice carrying over the square, warning of the dangers of sin and the importance of divine justice. The young man, now on the gallows, tried to speak, his words barely audible. The executioner, with a nod from the authorities, placed the noose around his neck. The crowd fell silent, their attention fixed on the scene. The trapdoor opened and the young man plummeted. The rope snapped taut, and his body jerked violently. The crowd let out a collective gasp, some looking away, others gawking with a mixture of horror and fascination. As the young man's body swayed, the executioner stepped back, his job done. The authorities, satisfied, began to disperse. The crowd, however, lingered, some discussing the execution in hushed tones, others simply standing in shock. The scene was a stark reminder of the power of the law, and the fear it instilled in the hearts of the people. The executioner, a man who had seen this many times, began to clean his tools. The body would hang there for a while, a warning to others. The square, once lively, now felt heavy with the weight of the morning's events. The cold air seemed to carry the echo of the young man's last moments, a chilling reminder of the price of breaking the law. As the day wore on, the crowd slowly thinned. The city returned to its routine, but the memory of the execution lingered, a dark shadow cast over the lives of those who had witnessed it. The authorities, in their grand halls, continued to plan and govern, their decisions often leading to more such spectacles. The people, in their homes and on the streets, carried on, but the fear of the gallows was always present, a constant reminder of the order they lived under. In the aftermath, the city's executioner, John Prima, found himself in the center of another spectacle. In 1418, he was accused of heresy and blasphemy, a crime that could have led to his own execution. The bishop's palace, usually a place of solemnity, was filled with a throng of people, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. John, standing on the steps, was a figure of scorn and fear. The crowd's reaction was immediate and violent. The press of bodies was so intense that an old man was crushed to death, and many others were injured. The son of a notary, John Eisern, was among the victims, and women lost their scarves and shoes in the chaos. Despite the horror of the scene, the crowd's reaction was not entirely unexpected. The people of the city, steeped in a culture of public punishment, had a fascination with these events. The details of executions, the dramatic moments, and the finality of the punishments were subjects of endless conversation. Yet there was a line that many did not cross. The influential writer Francis Aquinas advised against discussing such topics at the dinner table, warning that the graphic details could disgust or even sicken those who heard them. The famous preacher Vincent Ferrer, known for his powerful sermons, once told a story to illustrate a point. He spoke of a count who, after a long absence, returned home only to be unrecognized by his wife. She, suspicious of his identity, ordered his execution. The story, while intended to highlight the dangers of misjudgment, also reflected the ease with which one could find themselves on the wrong side of the law, a stark reminder of the fragility of life in a society where justice was often swift and unforgiving. As the day turned to night, the gallows and the steps of the bishop's palace stood as silent witnesses to the day's events. The city, with its mix of fear, fascination, and routine, continued to move forward, the echoes of the executions lingering in the air, a reminder of the price of defiance and the power of authority. In the mid-15th century, the Valencian poet John Roig embarked on a journey from Valencia to Paris. His account, though brief just 335 verses, painted a vivid and often gruesome picture of the times. Roig's narrative is filled with detailed descriptions of 6 executions, each more macabre than the last. These tales were not just morbid curiosities, but were designed to captivate and engage his readers. The first execution Roig described occurred near the castle of Sant Martí, between Tarragona and Barcelona. According to popular legend, Queen Sibylla had fled the palace after robbing and poisoning King Peter the Ceremonious. The story goes that she was caught, tortured, and some of her servants were burned. However, historical records suggest that the queen's courtiers, especially Berenguer d'Abila and Bartomeu Luns, were executed by the new King John I, who had been at odds with his stepmother. As Roig continued his journey to Paris, he encountered more tales of violence and retribution. In Paris, his landlady was accused of murdering her father, stealing his possessions, and fleeing with a friar. She was caught and condemned to a gruesome fate. She was placed naked in a sealed barrel with a snake, a cock, and a monkey, then thrown into the river. This story, while shocking, was a popular tale that Roig used to capture his audience's attention. Another Parisian execution involved a woman who had poisoned her husband with hippocras, a spiced wine. The crime might have gone unpunished, if not for the intervention of the deceased's bastard son. She was sentenced by the Parliament of Paris to be buried alive under her husband's body. However, she was later taken out alive, paraded through the city, and burned as a poisoner. The fourth crime Roig recounted took place in a famous Parisian pastry shop. The poet and his companions enjoyed a supper, only to discover that they had been eating human flesh mixed with beef and fine sauces. The 3 women responsible were quartered, their house demolished, and the ground scattered with salt. The bodies they had in the pantry were buried in a holy place. Roig also described a woman who, at night, approached the bodies of executed criminals hung on display gallows to extract their teeth for her spells. She was skinned alive and hung, and her skin was used to make jars. This tale, like the others, emphasized the perceived perversity of women, a theme that Roig revisited throughout his narrative. On his way back to Valencia, Roig encountered another execution in Lleida. A female baker was dragged and quartered, adding to the series of grim tales. Roig's descriptions of these executions were not just for shock value. They served to reinforce his broader message about the perversity of women and the justice that ultimately punished them. Roig also shared a curious tale about a woman in Saragossa who managed to avoid execution by getting pregnant 4 times consecutively. Each time she gave birth and immediately became pregnant again, extending her life. On the 5th occasion, she was finally hung, but it was discovered that she was indeed pregnant, and the midwives who had certified she was not had made a mistake. This story, with its frivolous and disrespectful tone, further emphasized Roig's obsession with the perversity of women. The executions Roig described were not just isolated events. They reflected the widespread presence of the death penalty in everyday life. The gallows were a common sight, and references to them appeared in various forms of literature, from troubadour poems to political propaganda. For example, the troubadour Raimbout de Vaqueras wrote a debate in which a Genoese woman wished him hung and threatened to cut his throat. Similarly, the impostor who claimed to be Alfonso the warrior was eventually hung, and this event was used by the troubadour Bertrand de Born to criticize King Alfonso the Chaste. Even more serious literary works, such as the Servants written during the invasion of Catalonia by Philip III the Bold of France, used the threat of hanging as a form of poetic propaganda. The anonymous poet declared that the followers of the King of Aragon would be hung, and the king himself would be hung like a thief. The ease with which the death penalty was referenced in literature reflected the social and political structures of the time. King John I, for example, explained that he tried to be a good ruler by following the examples of past kings and avoiding the mistakes of figures like Nero, who was hung after his death. This use of historical examples to justify capital punishment was a common theme. In everyday life, the gallows became a figure of speech used to express various sentiments. A pilgrim returning from Rome expressed his disdain for the church by wishing that its Christianity would go to the gallows. A merchant from Tuscany, after suffering financial losses due to his partner's disloyalty, wished that his partner would be hung. The gallows were also used to describe impossible situations, as when the representatives of Angelsola told a treasury official that they could not meet his demands even if he threatened to hang them. The gallows even found their way into leisurely entertainment. In a play called La Visita, the characters used the threat of hanging in a light-hearted manner, reflecting how the gallows had become a part of everyday language and culture. In the context of the Civil War, the people of Barcelona were described as being forced to join the popular militia, looking as if they were on their way to the gallows. This simile captured the reluctance and grudging participation of the people. Through these stories and references, the gallows became a symbol that permeated medieval society, reflecting the harsh realities of justice and the social norms of the time. In the 15th century, the mention of the gallows and the death penalty, even in jest, could reflect deep-seated fears. Jaume Safont, a notary from Barcelona, kept a diary that captures the tense political climate of the time. In February 1462, he wrote about those opposed to the municipal government, noting that they seemed to be looking for the gallows but couldn't find them. He said, "I think they have been looking for the gallows for many days, and they have not been able to find it." Safont's diary also records a dispute among the councillors of Barcelona in 1475. He commented that some councillors would prefer to be beaten on a mule through the streets, rather than listen to harsh accusation. He wrote, "Many of them would prefer to be beaten on a mule around the whole city, rather than listen to half of the nastiness that was said before their faces, so many good people being present." The gallows were a common symbol of punishment, often used in jest, but with underlying tension. In 1409, during the campaign to integrate Sardinia into the crown of Aragon, it was said that the Sards would rather hang the Catalans and eat their livers than accept their rule. The gallows, therefore, were not just an instrument of justice, but a powerful symbol of social and political conflict. The gallows were a constant presence in the landscape and in conversation, yet they represented the ultimate consequence of evil. They were a visual reminder of the justice system's role in punishing those who were considered enemies of society. In France, a medieval text called Ça nous dit describes a dispute over the burial of an excommunicated rich man. The story ends with the man being buried at the foot of the gallows, symbolizing social rejection and the expression of divine will. The gallows were a real danger, as the weight of power could fall on anyone. However, there was a way to overcome this through religious invocation. The Virgin Mary and the saints were believed to have the power to intervene and save those who showed devotion. A collection of miracles from Leyda in the early 13th century tells of a thief who, despite his crimes, was saved by the Virgin Mary. After being hanged, he remained alive for 3 days, looking beautiful and unharmed. When the Virgin's intercession was recognized, he was taken down and entered a monastery to do penance. Another famous story involves St. James, who is said to have supported a pilgrim who was unjustly hanged. This narrative is depicted in an altarpiece from the church of St. Jaume de Frontanya in Catalonia, showing St. James holding up the body of the hanged man. God's intervention was often linked to the idea of justice and the protection of the innocent. A tale from the early 13th century in Leyda describes a woman accused of adultery who was saved from a trial by fire because she had confessed and been absolved. The accuser, who turned out to be a demon, disappeared when he was placed on the pyre. In the 18th century, a Jesuit named Juan de Villafane documented a case from 1323 where a man in Toulouse was saved from the gallows 3 times by the Virgin of Montserrat. The ropes broke each time, and the man was eventually freed after explaining his innocence to the judge. These stories highlight the belief that the Virgin and the saints could intervene in the most extreme situations. They provided a sense of hope and justice, even in the face of the most severe punishments. The gallows, while a symbol of the ultimate power of the state, could be overcome by the divine, offering a chance for redemption and salvation. The presence of gallows and the public display of executed individuals remained a prevalent feature of the landscape throughout the modern period, carrying forward a legacy from the medieval era. In many parts of Europe, the gallows were not just places of execution, but also served as powerful symbols of authority and law. Painted landscapes by artists like Pieter Bruegel often included gallows, depicting the brutal reality of capital punishment. For example, in his more serene paintings of peasants celebrating, a gibbet often stood prominently, emphasizing the underlying tension and the symbolic weight of such structures. In Barcelona, the gallows played a significant role in religious practices. Fragments of ropes used in hangings were taken to the cathedral, where they were revered as amulets to protect against death. These practices reflected a blend of religious piety and popular superstition. For instance, if a rope broke during an execution, it was believed to have special protective powers. Leonardo da Vinci, in his observations, noted that some men executed by hanging experienced priapism, an erection that occurred due to the flow of blood. This observation contributed to various popular beliefs, such as the idea that the semen or urine of hanged men had magical properties. In the 19th century, Jacques Collin de Plancy wrote that mandrake plants sprinkled with the urine of hanged men grew to be the most potent. The gallows also served as a tool of intimidation, reinforcing the notion that bad acts lead to a bad payment. In Germany, the presence of beheading swords, though primarily symbolic, underscored the severity of the law. The spread of printing in the modern age further popularized narratives surrounding executions, creating a rich gallows literature. This literature often mixed crime and sin, reflecting the moral and religious concerns of the time. For example, in Catalonia, popular chapbooks detailed the adventures of bandits and their eventual fate on the gallows, which became a form of public spectacle. The execution of criminals was not just a legal process, but also a social and cultural event. In Barcelona, for instance, the execution of a heretic named Jacques Prima drew a large crowd, resulting in chaos and even fatalities. The public nature of executions meant that they were imbued with a sense of moral and religious significance. The bodies of the executed were often displayed as a warning to others, and the methods of execution varied widely, from hanging to burning at the stake. The integration of the gallows into everyday life and language reflected a society that had fully embraced the death penalty as a means of maintaining order. In literary works such as the Espill by John Roig, the gallows and the punishments they represented were used to illustrate the consequences of sin and crime. The vivid descriptions of executions and the harsh penalties meted out to criminals served as a stark reminder of the social and moral norms of the time. In this context, the gallows were not just physical structures, but symbols of power, law, and the moral order. They played a crucial role in shaping the public consciousness, reinforcing the idea that lawbreakers would face severe consequences. The omnipresence of the gallows in the landscape and in popular culture underscored the deep-rooted nature of these beliefs and practices in medieval and early modern European society. The death penalty has been a tool of power and social cohesion in Europe since the 12th century, largely due to the influence of Roman law. This law not only legalized the practice, but also elevated it to a symbol of the sovereign's authority. The sovereign, holding the marum imperium, had the ultimate power to decide the fate of their subjects, including the right to take their lives in the name of justice. Gratian, in his influential Decretum, drew a distinction between the Old Testament, which prescribed physical punishment, and the New Testament, which emphasized correction and penitence. However, he also argued that those who imposed capital punishment as part of their public duty were not to be blamed. They were, in fact, ministers of the law, acting on behalf of a higher authority. This view was echoed by later theologians, such as Peter of Blois, who justified the use of the death penalty as a necessary tool for maintaining order and justice. Thomas Aquinas, a prominent medieval theologian, addressed the moral and religious objections to the death penalty. Some argued that physical punishment was illicit, citing the book of Exodus and the Gospel of St. Matthew, which prohibited killing. They believed that as long as a person was alive, they had the potential to be redeemed and should be given the chance to repent. Aquinas, however, rejected these views, emphasizing the duty of the ruler to protect the common good. He argued that the common good is more important than individual lives, and that those who pose a threat to society should be removed to prevent harm. Aquinas compared the ruler to a doctor, both of whom aim to maintain harmony and order. Just as a doctor removes diseased tissue to prevent the spread of illness, a ruler must eliminate dangerous elements to preserve societal peace. He supported this with biblical references, such as the Epistle to the Corinthians, which commands the removal of evil from society, and the Epistle to the Romans, which affirms the ruler's role in punishing wrongdoers. For Aquinas, the possibility of repentance was not a valid reason to spare a criminal's life. He believed that even those condemned to death could still find redemption through repentance and penance. Moreover, many of these individuals were so obstinate that they would never change their ways, making their removal from society a necessary act of justice. The death penalty, therefore, served as a powerful tool for consolidating power and ensuring social cohesion. It was a means for rulers to demonstrate their authority and protect the common good, even if it meant taking the lives of those deemed dangerous. This perspective, shaped by both legal and theological arguments, has left a lasting impact on the way societies have approached justice and punishment.